Welcome to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you want effective and actionable tips to simplify the overwhelm of launching and managing your podcast, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Verity Songon, podcast manager, launch strategist, and host of a Top 100 podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode.
Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. And what we are going to be talking about in this episode is rebranding your podcast. So particularly when you feel that your podcast name no longer reflects your brand or your message. And changing your podcast name can be a big decision, and it's really important to ensure that any changes that you make align with your vision and goals. So that's really what I want to dig into for this episode. But first of all, I want to talk about my own experience with rebranding a podcast. I was going to say my podcast, but obviously I haven't rebranded this podcast. My other podcast that I have is the Confident CEO podcast, but it didn't start out as the Confident CEO podcast. It started back in April of 2022 as under the name of Bloggers Creating Courses. And it was a podcast with the aim of teaching bloggers how to create an online course with a mix of solo episodes from me and interviews with experts in the course creation field. And whilst I absolutely loved producing these episodes, I found that the more content I created for that podcast, the more I realised that the conversation wasn't just around creating an online course, but around wider business conversation in general. So I then did a deep dive and came to realise that my primary audience was female entrepreneurs in the first couple of years of business. And I also realised that the business topics that I was covering on the podcast weren't really being covered elsewhere. You know, I could find plenty of business podcasts covering how to build your email list, how to implement a Pinterest strategy, for example, but I wasn't finding much about creating and achieving aligned business goals, for example, or how to have an authentic presence on social media. So I took that information and sat down with it, and I got really tough on myself about what I actually wanted to achieve with the podcast. And I realized two things. The first one was that I wanted to give more to the business conversations that I didn't think were being talked about enough in the female entrepreneur space. And also I wanted to serve the female entrepreneur community in a slightly different way from what I was seeing other podcasts in the space do. And so I decided to rebrand. So it started out with the artwork for me. There was nothing wrong with my original artwork, but I felt that it was just too corporate and more corporate than it needed to be. So I changed it to bright pink. And what happened? Well, within days, I had somebody message me on LinkedIn saying how they thought I was so brave and they loved how brave I was being for using pink in my branding because it wasn't done enough and it made my podcast stand out to them. Now, that was not something I expected to hear, but I found it really reassuring and a lovely message to receive nonetheless. And what I really learned from this is that remembering that your podcast is yours and run with the artwork that you like and you think best represents your branding and your podcast, and just don't overthink it. I think quite often we can really overthink our podcast artwork and don't feel that you have to match a certain theme or prerequisite just because of the genre that your podcast sits in. And just as a little caveat there, for anyone who's interested, I did create my podcast artwork for both my podcasts in Canva Pro because I just find it so super useful and easy to use. So when it came to the name of the podcast, I took a little bit longer on that because as I said, it was called Bloggers Creating Courses. I didn't feel that fitted anymore. And I didn't want to just switch to another name though really quickly and then I'd regret it and then end up wanting to change it again because I thought that would just be even more confusing. So I continued to sit on Bloggers Creating Courses for some time, even though the conversation was changing. And I would say that it was as early as episode 15 that the conversation was shifting. And this is why I go on and on and on about planning and strategy is so important. But as I said, what I didn't want to do was, confuse my relatively new audience with a sudden name change. So how did I come up with that new name? Well, the truth was that I didn't. I was actually in a one-to-one call with a marketing guru and it was her who gave me the idea. You see, we were talking through my aims and goals for the business and she said that it sounded as though my mission was to help female CEOs building their confidence when it came to the podcast. And it was literally like a light bulb moment. and the Confident CEO was just instantly in my head, and it was the new name. I did a quick search on Apple Podcasts, and there was already a podcast called The Confident CEO, but it only had about 3 episodes on it, and it had not been touched since pre-pandemic. It was really, really old. So I decided that there wasn't going to be any confusion there. So what I did is I then did a rebrand announcement episode, and in episode 29 I revealed the new branding, announcing the name and direction of the content that listeners could expect. And I felt that this was really important because it showed a definite line in the sand and a shift for the podcast. Listeners weren't suddenly wondering what the heck was going on with the new podcast name, and also listeners could choose if they liked the sound of the rebrand and the new content strategy, or if they wanted to stop listening and just move on. So with all of this in mind, I'm going to just take you through some of my top tips of what I learned from rebranding my own podcast. So first of all, evaluating your current brand and audience. Before you go about choosing a new name or any sort of rebranding, evaluate your current brand and audience. Really consider to yourself what your podcast is about, who your target audience is, and what message you want to convey. Look at your branding, your logo, your colours, the overall aesthetic, and determine if it's still fitting your vision and goals. Brainstorm potential names. You can use something like ChatGPT if you're really, really struggling for ways to get started, but consider using a name that is descriptive of your content or niche, but is also catchy and memorable. Consider the availability and uniqueness of your name. Don't go after something which is already trademarked or has got some kind of copyright around it. Think about what is available, what is unique, what isn't going to confuse people, what isn't going to lead to legal issues as well. Test the name with a focus group or a survey. Reach out to your current audience and see how they gauge your name. How well does it resonate with them, and whether it actually reflects the content and tone of your podcast. You can go down a route of using something like Jotform or Google Forms to gather feedback, or it could be as simple as putting out a poll sticker on your Instagram stories. Plan that smooth transition for your listeners. Changing your podcast name can be a big adjustment for your listeners, so it's important to plan a smooth transition. Make sure to announce the name change well in advance and explain the reasons behind it. And you can do this through social media, email, newsletters, or even a special episode dedicated to the rebranding like I did. Once you've renamed your podcast, remember to update your cover art if you haven't already, and also update your website and social media profiles to reflect your new podcast name, or your podcast new name, I should say. You might want to put a line in your podcast description for a few weeks bracketing the show's previous name, just so that listeners don't get confused and they actually make a connection that it is the same podcast that they're listening to. But with careful planning, there's no reason why you can't change your podcast name in quite a succinct and efficient manner. And the result of me changing the name of my podcast, well, for me, The Confident CEO has continued to scale to new heights. We have reached the top 50 in the entrepreneurship business podcast charts in Apple Podcasts in both the UK and Ireland, and we consistently rank in multiple countries in the top 250 of those charts in Apple Podcasts. So for me, changing the name of the podcast and going through a rebrand was 100% worth it, because I genuinely believe that changing the name and the branding, the colours, the artwork has really helped with the shift and has brought new listeners in. We know that new listeners have come in because I think that the new name has really appealed in a way that the previous name did not. There's been a lot less confusion over what we discuss on the podcast. The title itself is more search friendly from an SEO point of view. And as I said, our listenership has continued to grow. If you are looking to rebrand your own podcast and you have got some questions about it, you're not really sure where to start, you want an action plan or a roadmap to make sure that your rebrand is as successful as it possibly can be, then you can book in for a podcast power hour with me. You can either DM me on Instagram at VeritySongon to get booked in, or you can book in directly at veritysongon.com/power-hour, and that link will be in the show notes. Otherwise, I will see you next episode.